And let me just take a few minutes to introduce each of the speakers. Bombay holds a PhD in social anthropology from the University of St. Andrews in Scotland. And you currently work as a senior researcher and a curator at the Royal Museum for Central Africa. And you also teaches at School of Arts in Ghent and St. Lucas in Antwerp and the American University in Brussels, right? So you have many shoes. And apart from your work as a museum curator and a teacher, you also conduct research focusing on Belgo-Congolese colonial history and its afterlives, and Congolese arts and cultures, Congolese in Belgium, museum representations of African and Africans, and autochthony as a discourse for various groups considered as being others. And it's really my pleasure to get to know you through this webinar. And this is a nice part about hosting, this kind of meeting. Now, at the distance, but we can meet individually. And then, so warm welcome. And I have also a very great pleasure to introduce two of my relatively old colleagues whom I know from my different biographical stations. Linda, you are trained in sociology and educational sciences, and she's currently acting professor for sociology, culture, and migration at the University of Frankfurt am Main. After you hold a guest professorship for gender and inclusive citizenship at Leibniz University in Hanover. But he also previously worked at the University of Münster and the Institute for Advanced Study in the Humanities, Essen, and the Institute of Education in London. And your research interests include diversity in immigrant and post-migrant societies, and your work has been looking at how this diversity, migration-driven or related diversity, is represented in official statistics and social surveys. And she has, you have published really wide-led dissertation in the German-speaking countries called Statistics and Racism, the Dilemma of Capturing Ethnicity, I think up here 2014. And even before her debut in academia as a PhD holder, you have published your master's thesis on decentered positioning, Stuart Hall's concept of identity politics. So warm welcome as well. And after years of non-communicating, I have a pleasure to introduce Vasilis. You have been a professor of sociology at the Kyiv University of Life Sciences for some time now, right? And but before you embarked on this professorship, you've been coordinating, numerous projects. One of them is, the research project on border crossings. It was, I think, in the EU project, MyGapNet, transnational digital networks, migration and gender at the University of Hamburg. And before that, you were also project coordinator of the EU project, Young Urban Cartography of UMAP in the Youth in Action program. And you also participated in one of the, I think, earliest studies, critical migration studies at the University of Frankfurt, the Institute of European Ethnology and Cultural Anthropology, I think where the whole thing has started, I could say, from my recollection of these memories. So, you're one of the first ones to form this part of migration scholarship in the German context and beyond. So, and then your research interests include racism analysis and autonomy of migration. And again, like Linda, but from a different theoretical perspective, slightly different perspective, post-migrant society, and the European border regimes and biometric border control, something that you can see in his publications in your project you've involved in. So I am very much delighted to have smaller but very interesting group of people, scholars, and with an activist shoes, and also active in art and creativity, sense of creativity, and then we have, I think most of the audience are IMESCO members, but not all. And then I would appreciate if you have a camera, if you could turn it on so that we don't speak into like empty box, if that allows you to do, if it allows you to do that, okay? And as a preparation, in preparation for today's seminar, the main coordinators of this seminar series have formulated a set of questions that have been addressed in the earlier episodes of this webinar. And my suggestion is really to stick to these questions as a way to structure our conversation. But I also don't see it as a very rigid thread of discussion, but rather as a help to, form the discussion. So let me maybe first start off with the first, question. Let me ask you, what are the main historical elements underpinning race and racism in the Belgium and German context? Can I maybe ask Bambi to comment on that? Really to start highlighting on your spatial context of this really big question.
Sorry. First of all, thanks very much for inviting me. Although when I received the invitation, I did say that I'm not really working on race and racism in Belgium in general, but that my research has a clear focus on Belgians of Congolese descent and by extension Afro-Belgians in general. So my idea then is really to try to combine a general overview of the situation in Belgium with a focus on Belgians of Congolese descent or African descent in general. But I'm glad to see that Ilke Adam is there as well. So I am sure that she can fill in the gaps that will, if and when they will become clear in what I am about to say. I think there is quite a difference in Belgium between public debates on race and racism and theoretical debates, and that I have the impression that they are growing further apart in some senses and then approaching one another more in other senses. It's important to realize that Belgium, like Germany for that matter, is a federal state, and so that some policies are organized on the federal level and other on the regional level. And I should also stress that as I am a Dutchophone and I live in Brussels, I am not so up to date, and I've had some difficulty finding some information regarding what happens on the regional level, regional and communal level as regards Francophone Belgium, but that again is related to the fact that, as I said, I'm not a researcher who works on race and racism per se. But there is clearly the influence of the French Republican model in Francophone Belgium, i.e. The idea that irrespective of ethnic or national background, Belgian citizens are first and foremost citizens, full stop. There is a tendency to interpret discrimination and poverty insofar that it is related to a group formation in terms of class rather than race, and also to conceive of it as an individual rather than a structural responsibility. There is also very much a notion which is similar to the German Leitkultur, the idea that so-called foreigners should adapt or assimilate. What is very worrying is that many of the views of the radical right-wing Flemish Nationalist Party, Vlaams Belang, have become mainstream, and that some of the demands that were made in the party's infamous 70-point plan that was called Immigration, the Solutions, 70 proposals for the solution of the problem of foreigners, which Vlaams Blok, as it then was, published in 1992, so that a number of these have become official policy at the federal level or in Flanders. And I will name just a few, but I'm sure that if there's some that I've forgotten, that Ilke can remind me of them. So on the federal level, there are now stricter expulsion and repatriation policies for asylum seekers. Detention centers have been created. There is a state secretariat for immigration. The conditions for becoming a Belgian citizens have tightened. The punishments for marriages of convenience are more severe. People wanting to return can be awarded a premium. There is no list of politically unsafe countries, as was demanded by Vlaams Blok, but there is a list of safe countries on which basis decisions are taken as regards sending asylum seekers back or not. On the regional level, there is now, and this is very recent, a ban on ritual slaughter in Flanders. Social housing is not reserved for Flemings, but candidates must give proof of knowledge of Dutch. There is no citizen test for aspiring Belgian citizens, but all non-European immigrants must follow a so-called integration course in Flanders and in Brussels, and Wallonia will follow as well. And then, as regards theoretical debates on race and racism in Belgium, what is very striking that there is no research on racism as a conceptual category. This is a gap that was felt even some 10 years ago when I was actually invited to work on a book project on that topic, but that never saw the light of day. There are hardly any studies on anti-Black racism as a specific form of racism related to the transatlantic slave trade and colonialism. And it's the implication of the southern Low Countries in the transatlantic slave trade is a part of Belgian history that is not well known. So that, again, is something that needs to be addressed more fully. There is as yet no research on whiteness as a category in the Belgian context. And there are still very few studies on Belgians of sub-Saharan African descent as a separate category among other Belgians with a migration background, with a focus primarily on Muslims and then mainly from Morocco and Turkey, and increasingly also a focus upon super diversity. But as I said, from my perspective as someone who works on the Belgian colonial past and Belgians of Congolese descent, remarkably little research that has an exclusive focus on these topics compared to research that is being done in other former colonial metropoles in Europe.
Thank you, Bambi. Ilka, do you feel like stepping in spontaneously right now? You have also later a chance to, reflect on Bambi's contribution as well. We can't hear you.
I was very happy to listen to Bambi's perspectives on that. I don't think I have to add, but yeah, what you have is this. This historical knowledge also on the continuation of the Belgian colonialism up on how we see discourses also today, and the continuity on that. I think that's very, very insightful. Yeah. But I will listen. I only have to leave for an interview at 2:00. Yeah.
All right. Okay. So Linda and Vasilis, I heard that you have an arrangement. So whoever feels like being addressed.
We don't hear you, Vasilis. You need to turn on.
Zach. Yes. Thanks for the invitation, and thanks for the possibility to see you again, Kyoko, after so many years. Yes, I will begin with the question, with a small history or prehistory of silencing of race in the German discussion about racism. And I will begin with a very important quote for the German discussion from Werner Conze. By 1985, Werner Conze had noted under the entry race in the geschichtliche Grundbegriffe, basic historical concept, one of the most important lexicon and concept of the Germans of German, if you want, geschichtliche Grundbegriff, which is authoritative for contemporary history and social sciences. That his concept has that the concept of race. So the opinion of Werner Conze, that the concept of race had become I quote, quite meaningless, especially among the German people after National Socialism. 1985. The term racism, which had emerged as a derogatory designation of Nazi racial ideology, the entry continued, could now be applied to other offensive cases such as South Africa. Quote end. 1985. There is no race in the meaning and thinking of one of the most important historians in Germany, and if there is race is not a concept to analyzing social relations or in Germany, perhaps South Africa. But who is Werner Conze? Werner Conze was not only party member of the National Socialistic Party, he was not only a fascist. Werner Conze was also SA-Mitglied and a very actively social engineer, if you want, in the context of the eliminatory plan called Generalplan Ost, 1985. Okay. I think this kind of exterritorialization of the concept of race and racism in Germany, and very often from ex-members of the Nazi Party with a very important after post-fascistic, if you want, academic career after the war, is very, very paradigmatic for understanding the difficulties and conflicts inside the German-speaking also. Austria is not very others of this, to understand the intellectual and academic blockade, if you want, in the German historical and sociological debate about race and racism. In fact, until recently, racism was considered by German contemporary history and social research as an, as I said, external object like South Africa, so Werner Conze, of study located in other times and places. Thus, for about 30 years, an increasingly differentiated historical research on anti-Semitism has been established, and German colonial racism, as well as racism directed against Sinti and Roma and against migrant, so-called migrant others, Migrationsanderer phenomena that intersect in many respects, are also being historically addressed. So colonial racism, anti-Semitism, anti-Tsiganism are historically very are objects of or also being historically very well addressed. But this research focused on the period up to 1945. The setting of this caesura had the consequence that racism did not become an object of historiography about the Federal Republic and of the social sciences. The thesis of 0 hour die Stunde Null made in the post-war period, especially with the advent of the Cold War, was reproduced for decades by contemporary historical research and, with regard to the treatment of foreigners, was hardly questioned until recently. This, however, affected the definition of what was and still is considered racism within German historiography and social sciences, namely racial segregation systems, racially based genocidal violence policies, and the corresponding ideologies of them, as well as the explicit use of the concept of race. Institutional, structural, and everyday discrimination, degradation, and acts of violence against people on the basis of their origin, which primarily affected migrants in Germany after 1945, were not included in the historical large-scale phenomenon of racism and were therefore not seen per se in continuity with the structure, attitudes, and practices before 1945. This is the first tip, if you want, of the disarticulation between race and racism analysis in Germany. The bifurcation, can say. The successive tabuization of the term race, which admittedly never completely disappeared from everyday languages and basic law, das Grundgesetz Article 3, was seen as an evidence that the corresponding body of knowledge had also been erased. This corresponds by the fact that inadequate contemporary sociological concepts emerge in the form of Ausländerfeindlichkeit, xenophobia, which newly defined, explained, and named certain forms of hatred and resentment against others of origin and their discrimination. Sociology thus provided cover concepts that implicitly cut historical continuities. This is a methodological, if you want, nationalistic problem of the sociology, the focusation of interaction without history. Especially since they explained events primarily from the respective care, and now, or anthropologically, and partly also functionalist, also in the context of functionalism. But adapting this conception relatively uncritically and unseen, historiography and social science sanctioned the erasure of the historical dimension. As a result, there is hardly any historical research in Germany that seriously investigates the question to what extent one can assume systemic racism in the case of federal German society, and that means a historically involved complex encompassing all spheres of life that links the current contemporary diagnosis of racism with the past, present, and older as a continuum, or as a continuum with breaks. The missing link is the continuous historiographical and social analysis that could provide evidence of the extent to which racist practices of thought and action jumped over the supposed time barrier of 1945, developed further, transformed and adapted themselves, and culminated as a new variant in today's conditions, admittedly under different political and social conditions. One of the central, this is my last point, one of the central working hypotheses here is that this blind spot in contemporary German history is not innocent and accidental, but one of a meta level is itself part of a history of silencing racism in Germany since 1945. This historiographical void, of course, goes hand in hand with the scarcity of the discourse on racism, with Manuela Boyadzi's term, in academia, the public sphere, and politics as a whole, which has been denounced by researchers critical of racism for more than 30 years, like Kalpaka, Retzel, Jäger, and Rommelsbacher, Terkesidis, Rodriguez, and so on, and Paul Mechel also. The consequences of the resulting general lack of knowledge about modern racism theory can be seen just as impressively in the current debate, in which racism is spoken of almost inflationary, but which is characterized by a great terminological fuzziness and historical unformedness. Moreover, the hegemonial role of the social psychological research in Germany in the context of the racism analysis oriented to this concept, which have been translated into phase of the so-called group-specific misanthropy, gruppenbezogene Menschenfeindlichkeit, for a good 20 years, have not succeeded in grasping or even explaining this phenomena behind the individual and symptomatic. The question is, whatever the historiographical blindness or silencing of race to these questions was epistemological naiveness, or whether this ignorance is rather a central epistemic vehicle by means of which racism in its multiple modes of operation is maintained even in a supposedly post-racist or post-migrant related system. The widespread absence of the concept of race and even of the critical concept of racism in the political, activist, and also scholarly discourse surrounding the treatment of the German other until the late 1980s cannot be read as an absence of racist practices, bodies of knowledge and structures, but rather as the result of a multifactorially conditioned and naming, silencing of the concept of race and the silent naming of the reality of racism. Thanks.
Thanks, Vasilis. Linda, would you like to jump in here, or?
I actually wanted to spare my comments for another question later, because yeah, I think
Sure.
Vasilis really brought this to the point already.
Sure. We are flexible, and as I said, the kind of questions that we have circulating in advance are just meant as a thread to structure our conversation. So, I mean, Bambi and Vasilis, both of you, really made clear whatever the whatever the phenomenon now we look at in a post-migrant society or migrant society, history plays a really big role. And then Bambi, you talked about no concept of racism or no category of whiteness. Or Vasilis, you did talk about the silencing of racism. But I think you mean the same thing, more or less. And this really shows that, in our contemporary understanding and debating about this topic has a very, it inevitably has a historical roots in how race has been treated or not treated, and how it is being debated on which to be silenced. And that has consequences for how we debate or not to debate these terms, both in everyday life, political discourse, but also in an academic discussions. I think both of you made that point clear. And then you also now, both of you had actually have begun to talk about, the bridge between the past and the present, continuities and discontinuities. And I'd like to invite you then, maybe I now start off then with Linda. If you say there was a silencing of the term, what are the terms of public and theoretical debates to describe, racism or whiteness in institutions? Maybe you can also relate your comments that you wanted to say for other points.
Yes, thank you, Kyoko. I think, one terminology that is being used for a longer term in Germany to describe the majority of the population would be the Dominanzkultur, dominant culture, which was a term coined by Birgit Rommelspacher already in the 1990s, I think. And this was already a helpful term to address power relations and to make them more visible and accessible to analysis. I think other terminology Vasilis already mentioned in his his historical mapping of the silencing of race and its replacement with other terminology. So there has been the Ausländerfeindlichkeit, which is something like xenophobia, but rather foreigners' enmity, not phobia, right? So it's something different. Or also Fremdenfeindlichkeit, which is enmity towards strangers. Then there have been there has also been created terminology to address if actually what I would express now as anti-Muslim racism, that would have been called Islamkritik. It's a very much by choosing this different term is actually you talked about something completely different, and you suppose by speaking of a critique of religion that this is actually about a theological question, but it never has been. It never has been that much sophisticated, but it's always bluntly racist. Yeah, so there have been somehow placeholder vocabularies over the years, and yeah, I spoke about Ausländerfeindlichkeit and Fremdenfeindlichkeit, terms that really also damage discourse because it anchored the notion of those people who are not liked, who are excluded from society. They would be strangers and foreigners, and this was still the case. This term was still used when people have been naturalized for second generation and not being foreigners at all, but who were also, people with German passports. So the term really did produce problematic effects in this discourse that we are still struggling with today. But yeah, I also see changes here, and with I think there's also really happening a lot in public discourse in these days, following for one thing, the George Floyd murder and the really public explosion of the Black Lives Matter movement, but also following the terrorist attacks that happened in Germany last year in Hanau and in Halle, which had a massive effect on public awareness of the issue of racism in Germany, and which even led to the federal president in a morning event in Hanau speak about himself as an old white man. So this was something really special in German discourse, that an important political speaker addressed himself as a white, and yeah, this was noticed as well. So things are changing in public discourse, and there has, I think, I have been working on, as a sociologist, I've been working on racism really a lot of time during my career, and I've rather not seen myself as a migration researcher, but as a researcher of racism and discrimination in immigration countries, in Europe, mainly in Germany and Britain. And I have been reading texts by Vasilis Tsianos already when I was a student. So and so many other authors have been there who were addressing racism in German language. Also in Vasilis already mentioned some of their names. There's also more to name. And one remark I also wanted to take up was what Vasilis said about the the social psychological concept of gruppenbezogene Menschenfeindlichkeit, or I would translate it as group-focused enmity, but you said misanthropy, this is also valid. And something I looked at this concept a lot, and I had to work with it when I recently wrote a report on anti-Roma racism in Germany. And I was looking for numbers on the extent of anti-Roma racism in Germany, and the only thing available was this concept of group-focused enmity, gruppenbezogene Menschenfeindlichkeit, because this is a construct that is set together of, I think, 14 different dimensions of hate towards groups. And one of those groups is the Roma. So you can find data on hate towards Roma there. But with this problem, with this concept, something strange happens to racism, because of all the 14 dimensions of group enmity, racism is only one. There is also sexism and ableism and enmity towards homeless people, and anti-Semitism, anti-Muslim racism, sentiments against Roma, and then finally racism as one more small compartmentalized piece in this whole concept. And this is quite telling about the notion of what racism is about in large part of social science discourse, because it is regarded as only a biological concept. Yeah, it's only, someone would only be regarded as a racist if they believe in genetical differences being socially relevant. And in the meantime, we also incorporated very important notions like the one of Etienne Balibar's concept of cultural racism, that we have to take larger parts into consideration. And it's not only about nature or biology. I will leave it at this point. I think these were my major contributions on the terminology that is in use or that is changing.
Thank you, Linda. Now when looking at Bambi, I mean, your last comments really stopped, when you were talking about the main historical influences underpinning the no categories of race or whiteness. Now, I mean, now if you have heard what Linda has said, what are the terms of public and theoretical debates that will help to describe or capture the understanding of racism and whiteness in the context where you are active? Could you tell us a sense of that?
First of all, there is still a general tendency to associate racism with the Judocide during the Second World War, and therefore also the implication that as long as you do not want to exterminate a group in its entirety, you're not really talking about racism. There is a very clear spot as regards colonial racism, in that until very recently, even the term racism wasn't used. It was called paternalism. So Belgians treated Congolese in a paternalist way. But the whole issue of racism was completely ignored. As far as whiteness is concerned, I've seen that in the museum. So I am the curator of the gallery that deals with the history of the African presence in Belgium, and in French in particular. You cannot use the term white. You cannot talk about the Belge blanc. So you can talk about black people, but you cannot talk about white people. So I really had to fight for that, to get that term introduced in the museum gallery in French. In Dutch, the problem is that Dutch has actually two terms for white. And one is blank, which has the same meaning as blank has in English, i.e. something that is empty and that is clear, and then also by implication clean. And so there has been a struggle which started in the Netherlands to replace blank with white, the equivalent of zwart, because there was this clear idea that white, when you use the term blank, that it is not a category, it is an absence, literally, because it's empty, it's clear, it's transparent. And therefore the assumption that black is a category in a way that blank is not. And so there has been the struggle to replace blank with white. And then the first reactions that you get, which I always find very funny, is that, well, but we are not white. At most we are pink. Whereas when you ask black people to describe themselves, they will also say, well, we are brown, we are not black, but that's not the issue. And then the other thing which is very interesting is this denial to actually, I mean, this sense that we have the right to call ourselves whatever we want, which of course completely disregards the extent to which white people have imposed identities on other people throughout history. And so that's a struggle that is still not won. And then even in the mainstream media, for instance, there is no general consensus of which word has to be used. Whereas in the mainstream French media, again, the notion of whiteness is still completely absent. There is also the tendency indeed to talk about different kind of phobia rather than racism, Islamophobia, homophobia, etc., which suggests an irrational fear, which obviously goes against the long history of actually elaborating the supposed cultural and biological differences that would exist between so-called different races, which you cannot define in terms of an irrational fear, but are really intellectually elaborated. Whether you agree with them is another issue, obviously. And then also very contested on the Flemish side was the introduction of an opposition which was first used in the Netherlands of the term allochtonos instead of migrant, which was considered more neutral, but obviously is anything but. The idea that there are people who are autochthonous, i.e. rooted in the soil, as it were, as opposed of foreign imports. And so that is a term that is now used less and less. But what is worrying then that in Dutch, nowadays they talk about people with roots and really using the English words from elsewhere. So still the assumption that if you look differently, that you cannot possibly be a real Belgian. And so that you are rooted elsewhere and have been uprooted to Belgium, irrespective of the number of generations that people actually live in Belgium. And then in Flanders, I mean, it's a complicated country. There is the issue of language as well. When I was young, people in Flanders routinely addressed me in French because if you look differently, then you must come from elsewhere. So again, you cannot possibly be Flemish. Whereas nowadays, I'm very often addressed in English, but the assumption is exactly the same. I.e., if you are in Flanders and you do not look white, then you must come from elsewhere. And so you must speak a different language. And so that difference is then translated as if your skin speaks a different language as well, as it were. And so there is no notion of a hyphenated identity. Certainly people of African descent in Flanders cannot agree upon a term. In French, it's Afro-descendant, so of African origin. And that is now more or less accepted both by the people themselves, but it's also a term that you read in the literature and more in the mainstream press as well. There is no equivalent in Flemish, and there is no equivalent for people from other migratory backgrounds. So there is no idea of being Turkish Belgian or Moroccan Belgian. I mean, these are terms that people themselves can use to describe themselves, but these are not the kind of terms that you will routinely hear in the mouth of politicians or policymakers, that you will read in the press and so on and so forth. And so all this results indeed in still a bifurcation between those who really belong here, i.e. white Belgians, and those who do not, which can also lead to a lot of confusion in the case of mixed families, for instance, where members of the same family can look physically very different. And this is something that the vocabulary that is most commonly used cannot account for.
Yeah, I mean, at the, on a different level, the problematic that both of you have raised brings me nicely to the next question, especially when we look at these debates from a social scientific perspective. Now, data, we work in one way or the other with data. And so my question to you, both three of you, is what data is available, and what are the methodologies that are usually used in documenting racial and ethnic discriminations? I mean, you kind of touched upon it. I mean, if there's no official term about it, how to document it, and how legitimate also to use certain terminologies. I mean, I know that this is, this one of the topics that, Linda, you've been working on. But let me maybe just first to give the floor back again to Bambi, if you'd like to address this issue, and then to Linda or Vasilis.
Well, there are no official statistics on ethnic background. So that's a system that is it's almost identical to the one in France. And there is indeed great reluctance, especially on the Francophone side, to remain colorblind, as it were, whereas academics insist that they need these data to study discrimination. So now the only data that they basically have that gives them an idea of ethnic background is the country in which a person or that person's parents or grandparents are born, which has clear limitations, because by that token, I mean, a Belgian who was born during the colonial period in Congo could be considered Congolese, which in actual practice will not happen if that person happens to have a name that sounds Belgium. But so it's very difficult for researchers to get a clear sense, indeed, of the ethnic background of the Belgian population. There's, as in all European countries, I imagine, a federal center that deals with racism, which is, however, mistrusted by many racialized persons, because it does not deal with problems of structural racism, so it's only about individual racism. It refuses to condone blackface, etc. As far as field tests to measure discrimination are concerned, these deal not only with ethnicity, but also with age, disability, or gender. The Brussels region was the first to start with that in 2017. Last year, finally, the Flemish government found an agreement, and on the federal level, the existing legislation will be adapted this year, so that federal labor inspection services can carry out field tests and mysterious calls on its own initiative. But that also has been a real battle. As far as education is concerned, the Flemish and the French-speaking education systems are in the top 5 of the most unequal education systems in the EU. And then again, the challenge is to tease out the data that talk not only about social class, but also about ethnic background. And then as far as the PISA ranking of the OECD is concerned, it shows that Flanders has excellent results for so-called native pupils, but very bad results for children of an immigration background. Whereas Francophone Belgium is at the bottom of the league for pupils of both backgrounds. So that in a sense, you get the feeling that even if there are differences between the educational systems across the linguistic border, ultimately, it would appear that those from a migration background would fare worst of all. In terms of employment, the situation is also very bleak. Within the EU, Belgium is one of the countries with the lowest scores on the integration of migrants and their descendants into the labor market. In 2019, 61% of them were employed, which is almost 12% points lower than for those born in Belgium. Housing, there has been little research on housing, or insofar that it has been done, it is mostly based on crude divisions between EU and non-EU citizens, whereas comparative studies are usually limited to groups such as Turks, Moroccans, or Italians. And so these studies fail to take into account the great difficulty of individuals with an immigration background. And so there is a huge difference with research, which is with quantitative research, because, as I said, there the problem is precisely that there is no ethnic identification officially in Belgium, and then smaller scale qualitative studies, and there the focus is almost exclusively either on Muslims, i.e. Moroccans or Turks as specific groups, or on super diversity, i.e. on the high level of diversity in major city centers, but there's far less research on other groups from migration backgrounds, and that includes people of sub-Saharan African descent, although two studies, one in 2010 and one in 2017, have shown that on average, Francophone sub-Saharan Africans at least, and that includes those from the former colony, Belgian Congo, and the former protectorates and mandates Rwanda and Burundi, have on average a higher level of education than all other groups in Belgium, but also a higher level of unemployment. And the most detailed study on Congolese shows precisely that they combine the highest level of education of all groups in Belgium with the highest level of unemployment. And so these figures have been known since 2010, but even in the context of Black Lives Matter, now what we see is that if there is attention to the colonial past, also in relation to contemporary society, the focus tends to be on the decolonization of school curricula, colonial monuments, and so on and so forth, but not on problems related to discrimination as regards housing, employment. And I even though we know that, as I said, Congolese are on average the highest educated group in Belgian society, I have no figures actually on the situation of school children and students of Congolese descent or sub-Saharan African descent in general. So on the one hand, a problem with the quantitative data because of the lack of information on ethnic background, and on the other hand, a great imbalance in terms of the groups that are the focus of qualitative research.
Right.
But again, one thing that I forgot to mention as regards information that we have. So it was in 2011 that the Federal Centrum for Equality of Opportunities and Against Racism conducted a poll which established that on average white Belgians are most prejudiced indeed against Muslims, whereas their perceptions of Black people are still very much related to the colonial past, i.e. Big children, not very intelligent, lazy, but friendly, very good in sports, musicians, and highly sexualized. And then you see indeed that even though they are the group with the highest level of education in Belgium, the only ones that you actually see in the mainstream media tends to be athletes and musicians. And obviously that is very telling about the representation of people of African descent. And then there were, I can mention two other research data that we have about people of sub-Saharan African descent. One is a small study that was done about inter-country adoption during the 1990s, which contained interviews with a number of adopted parents who, for instance, did not want their Black adoptive children to go to university because they thought that they were too stupid for that. And then there was also mention of adoptive fathers who sexualized their Black adopted daughters, saying that they envied their boyfriends and things like that. And then there was a highly controversial study that was undertaken in 2000, and that was on the demand of the then Minister for Justice to study the relation between ethnicity and adolescent delinquency, which, due to the lack of knowledge about ethnic background, was only done on the basis of nationality, and therefore was highly controversial. And it's no wonder, because the researchers actually came from the Netherlands, so there was not a single researcher in Belgium who was willing to do this kind of research. And that established, amongst other things, that Congolese adolescents were overrepresented, both male and female. Whereas if you look at the prison statistics, they do not figure among the prison population at all. But as I said, because the methodology was so problematic, not much attention was paid to it by Belgian researchers. And as long as I said that we have no information on ethnic background.
Right. So I think you addressed, even the larger problems that come with the lack of categories or silencing of categories. And then, what kind of problems then it has reproduced to create again. And I would like to take one step back and ask, the colleagues from Germany, what your reflections on the question of data.
Yeah, so we decided this was my topic. I should speak about this because, yeah, as you already mentioned, Kyoko, in the beginning, this is really something I've been working on since my PhD project, the capturing ethnicity or ethnic background with the aim of measuring discrimination. This is something European nation states and societies need to do, obviously, when they have a law protecting their populations from discrimination. So there is some something that needs to be done, but it's really very similar to what Bambi Köpens told us just about Belgium in Germany, that we don't collect data on ethnic background or on racialized description or something alike, on who is actually white or black in this country. We only differentiate data by the migration background, persons with or without a migration background. And yeah, first of all, really, I could not give such an impressive presentation like Bambi just did with so many studies and numbers. I'm sorry that I haven't prepared that much to show you something about the German situation, but I can say regarding the studies and yeah, data available to show that discrimination exists. I would say also Germany, the most most reliable data at the moment is situation testings that are done on discrimination, and there are several studies. I could not really name a single ones now, but they have all been included in a report just issued in January, Fachkommission Integrationsfähigkeit. It was a report done for the federal government by an academic and practitioners commission, and they collected data from or bundled reports from several social fields, such as the housing market, so that it can be shown that it is a high difference in your chance to find a flat for renting if you have a Turkish sounding last name or if you have a German sounding last name. Here you see the difference, the line of difference that is drawn is being, these were the two comparison groups they built, right? So the German sounding name or the Turkish sounding name. So they didn't test for all different kinds of cultural backgrounds, but especially you can see this for being Turkish or being not Turkish. The same is with applying for a job. There are always that you can see that it's a difference whether you have a Turkish last name or, well, because the job application goes mostly with a picture, a photo. You could, they varied the Turkish name also with a woman wearing hijab or not wearing hijab. And then you could see that it was really, chances were lowest if you had a Turkish name and were wearing hijab. So, and we have also studies showing that in the educational system, there are effects of everyday racism or everyday discrimination working and having effects on children's success of education, because it could be shown that teachers tend to give less good grades to children with a migration background or children who were not speaking German at home as their main language. And we have also this highly separative educational system in Germany, right, with the 3 kinds of schools where you have to choose after 4th grade where to send the child to next. And it can be shown that children of migrant background are least likely to be sent to the gymnasium, the highest level of school education available. So there are many structural differences, and this shows also in the school system. However, there is this kind of field testing that can show this. So there is this methodology, but yeah, there are no data helping to differentiate between different ethnic groups. However, there has been or is a discussion going on to collect this kind of equality data. It has been going on in most EU countries already also. And the report for the government that I just mentioned and that Kyoko just also linked and sent over the chat, they had an expertise being written for their report on these kind of equality data. And at least they discussed this suggestion. And there is actually in the German the German discussion on how to measure discrimination, there is a slightly different suggestion than how data are collected in Britain or Ireland or the US, where there's the notion that you can just ask people about their ethnic group or about their race. That's what you would ask in the United States, but in Britain it would be ethnic group. And the suggestion in Germany would not be, well, let's not assume that there is just one answer to this question, because people cannot rightly be categorized in groups like that. It shouldn't be done. But what we can say is every person knows how other people see them. I do know that I'm seen as white, though I have a migration background, but no one addresses me as a migrant. So I know I'm passing as white, and I'm not suffering only very, very little from racist discrimination. There are a tiny number of incidents like that in my life. It was different for my father, who still had a strong accent. He's until now does have an accent and is not really speaking German fluently. Yes, so I could give the information in a survey that I'm usually seen as white, and other persons could give the information on their perceived ethnicity or their perceived racialization as well. And there have been several smaller studies trying to insert these questions on ascribed race or ascribed racialization. And yeah, it's actually a question that should be used more in social surveys, but yeah. This last expertise for the federal government, this expert commission decided this was not the way to go, and that they brought up actually not really convincing arguments against it, but it showed that they must have had a really long and difficult discussion inside their commission and couldn't agree to go forward with this. So we are stuck with a migration background concept. And it doesn't help to show who is really, who would be visible and be at high risk of discrimination in everyday life and who isn't. So.
Thank you, Linda. Also very important and interesting inputs, I think. I just have to, manage time. I must say I'm not a good time manager. I'm sorry. It was meant to be until 3:30, but I think it's also good to maybe take 5 to 10 minutes to, interact with the participants who haven't spoken anything yet in the audience. Otherwise, it just has the character of lecture. I have thought of that earlier, but I just was so much absorbed into your inputs. So would you agree on interacting the participants? Cool. So that may have been an unexpected turn for all of you, but anyone who would like to reflect on the contributions, or ask questions from completely different directions, all welcome. I see Hikari, Pavate, Hazel, Hazel, and Sarah. Maybe it was too random.
Hello, hi, thank you so
Hi.
much. Can you hear me?
Yes, perfect.
Thanks so much for an amazing set of conversations. Learned a huge amount, not only about Belgium and not only about Germany, but actually of 3 countries with Belgium, which was really fascinating, and also to think about this really from the perspective of the Roma and with the different types of racism. So I just wanted to say a huge thanks, but also to ask, in terms of anti-racist work across Europe, given that, we've had a few different talks, I'm just thinking, so have you people seen a lot of backlash to the anti-racist work? Because this was very much something that we see in France and Netherlands, but was there a backlash against the Black Lives Matters and all that?
Vasilis, do you want to answer? Or Bambi, yeah.
No, well, what happened in Belgium was that last year was also the 60th anniversary of Congolese independence, and so the Belgian king was supposed to go to Kinshasa for the celebrations, but could not go because of COVID-19. And then he wrote a letter to the Congolese president in which he expressed his deep regrets for the atrocities that were committed under the reign of Leopold II, who was his great-great-uncle, if I'm not mistaken, as well as for what happened during the colonial past, and linked that specifically to discrimination that people of African descent suffer in Belgium nowadays. And that was a letter that took everyone by surprise. No one had anticipated that. Then, in a sense, the rest of society had to follow, as it were. So as a result of that letter, the Belgian Federal Parliament decided to set up a commission that would deal both with Belgium's colonial past and with its repercussions for the situation of Black people in Belgium. And so we are still waiting for that report, but we anticipate that there will certainly be recommendations as regards research, but also perhaps certain policies. And so that happened almost simultaneously with Black Lives Matter in the US. And elsewhere. There was not really a backlash because, as a matter of fact, the backlash had already started. We now have, especially in Flanders, much less so across the linguistic border, new identity movements, and these are mainly white young men who are anti-gay, who are outspoken, racist, who are sexist and misogynist, and who see in someone like Leopold II, and other people who were involved in Belgian colonization as so many maligned white men whom they have to defend. And what is most striking is that most of them are Flemish nationalists, i.e. They are against the Belgian federal state because they want to establish a Flemish republic. But within this context of their identification as being white, they defend Leopold II, and so it has even led to the creation of a new song, which was then presented as being dated to the colonial period, whereas the first mention was only a few years ago. The lyrics of which talk about a chopping of hands, the Congo belongs to us. And so again, this very close identification with Belgian colonization of Congo. And as I said, this preceded Black Lives Matter. And as I also mentioned, what we have seen in the wake of Black Lives Matter are campaigns for the decolonization of public space, the decolonization of libraries. There's also increasing talk about the need and the necessity to integrate history lessons on the colonial past in secondary school education. There is right now at least one university that offers an MA in history that has made a course on the colonial past compulsory. But again, as I said, the questions about discrimination in terms of unemployment and housing, etc., are still not being addressed, even though some of the problems, as I said, have been known at least 10 years by now.
Many thanks. Thank you.
Nice question for the German. Can I speak, Linda? The momentum or the event Black Lives Matter as a global, as a new global cycles of anti-racist struggles, in my opinion, has to be rated in the German context as a moment, a very central moment or momentum inside a continuum between the Halle event and the Hanau event. The Halle event is a explicitly 100% anti-Semitic motivated terror action, and the Hanau event is an also terrorist attack with racist motivation against migrants. And inside this continuum between Halle, anti-Semitism, terrorist anti-Semitism, and terrorism and terroristic anti-migratism, if you want, we have recognized the epiphany of the new global cycles of anti-racism moment related to Black Lives Matter. For me, also important in this context is the communication of the anti-fascist or anti-racist movement in Germany with the French, with the movements, with the anti-racist movements in France. This is more closely, if you want, to us as the global phenomenon or event of Black Lives Matter. And about the backlash, we don't have in Germany comparable moments like in France. For the moment, it is unthinkable to attack the freedom of knowledge and research of anti-racist academics, like in France, in the name of laicism, in the name of republicanism. But it is possible to attack this in the name of the so-called anti-genderism. It is possible to attack gender studies in Germany. And there is some intersectional moments in this kind of, and you can see some intersectional moment as, in this case, as backlash. In the same time, we have also a constant level of acceptance, if you want, of racist politics in Germany, between 10 and 15 and 20%, possibly voters of AfD. Also, I cannot speak about backlash, but in comparison with France, if you want, because for me, France is a very difficult and very powerful situation. But we have this momentum of attack and backlash on the level of anti-feminism and gender studies, and it is a question of time. The epiphany of backlash against the critical scholars of migration, anti-Semitism, and racism studies.
Linda, would you like to add to that?
I would just back up Vasilis and agree that I think we don't see such a strong backlash at the moment. So times are really good for the anti-racist movement and for the race critical movement. Things are going forward here. And I hope this will continue like this. We can never be sure. There are so many bad things happening all the time, and we learn about police brutality incidents again and again, not only from the US, also in European context and in German context, and we hear from right-wing telegram networks among police officers but these networks have been there for some time, and they are whistleblowers. Now there are people who say this is enough, I will call them in. So I think that's really, it's a good moment in history, in anti-racist history, I think. Yeah, and definitely we don't see kind of reactionist movements against critical race theory as in France or as in Britain. So as I heard from colleagues over there, and I don't know why that is the case. Actually, I think someone is a bit slow over here in Germany. Yeah, but yeah. Yeah, so I'll leave it with this.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
Thank you for your question also, Pavati. I think it brought us to a new dimension. I think we can go on hours, exchanging. But I think we are already like 15 minutes over the time. I think nonetheless, I would like to give each one of the speakers the very last sentence or two, as a concluding remarks, if you would like. I'd like to invite you to that, the last statement. Bambi, would you like to start? No pressure. There should be another opportunity. So if you feel like too much, that's also all right.
No, well, I mean, do I have to start or do I have to finish? There are so many things to say, and I think it would indeed be interesting to look more in greater detail to the similarities between Belgium and Germany, because I said they're both federal states, but one obvious difference is that Belgium is, well, officially a trilingual countries, and so that leads to the fact that the regions indeed do develop different policies, with Francophone Belgium being much more focused upon what happens in France, as opposed to Flanders being much more focused upon the Netherlands. Simultaneously, fortunately not, I mean, in this regard, there is not indeed the same backlash against scholars doing work on racism and critical race theory in Francophone Belgium as there has been in France. There has been an incident lately whereby a researcher was very heavily attacked, but then the university stood very firmly behind her. And so that was an important signal. But I'm not so sure that I'm so optimistic as Linda, that this would be a good time for doing research on anti-racism, or indeed being involved in the struggle against racism. Because, I mean, there are worrying signs, and what Vasily was talking about was precisely about the same thing that as the identity Flemish nationalist movements that I'm talking about. So, yes, it can start with misogynistic remarks and with attacks on people who are transgender and so on and so forth. But I think that even if we have to be aware of the specificity of racist ideologies and discrimination in terms of ethnicity, religion, and so on and so forth, I think that we have to focus more on notions of whiteness and how they are being conceptualized by extreme right-wing groupings, even while, as I said, academics in Belgium are not even talking about whiteness, precisely because for them, I mean, for the members of this kind of identity movements, it encapsulates all that. It's not only about being white, it's also about being a man, and that means that it's about being a heterosexual man, and it means that it's about being a real man, and so on and so forth. So in a sense now, we are in a situation where all these notions are very much linked with one another, and I think that we have to look increasingly through that prism. So we have to deal on the one hand with intersectionality when it comes to people who are indeed being discriminated against, and on the other hand, we have to look at whiteness also in relation to people for whom whiteness is imbricated with heterosexuality, masculinity, and so on and so forth.
Thank you. I think it was a great concluding remarks. But yeah, Vasilis and Linda?
I have to underline everything of what Bambi said. I think one of the most important questions in Germany is to address the precariousness of whiteness in Germany. This is a very big, different complication to address whiteness in Germany and also in the social sciences. And I think this can be another point of another meeting. Whiteness, yes, is the most important for me, and the production of whiteness is the most important question in the currently condition of racism in Germany, in relation also to an understanding of systemic racism. We have to speak about the systemic, institutionalized dimension of racism in Germany. We don't have the instrumentarium. We have to discuss and to develop an instrumentarium for Germany and the German race relations, if you want. Both of them. The whiteness, the production of whiteness, and the systemic racism is for me are for me the most important points now.
Thanks. Linda?
Yes, I think I won't add much to my so optimistic assessment just a few moments ago, but I just wanted to say thank you, Bambi, for reminding me of this difference, or us actually, of this difference between wit and blank in the Dutch language, because I wasn't aware of. I know those terms, and I thought, oh my God, yes, this is really so instructive to understand what the problem of whiteness is, that whites think it's about being blank, but not white. And yeah, I think that I will really keep this for, and keep it and carry this difference in the Dutch language to my courses with students and show them what it's really about. That this, yeah, it's not about it's really not about blankness. And then again, Vasilis and me also discussed our common whiteness with each other, and we found that there is still a lot of differences in our experiences of racism, and this whiteness really has it's not only about visibility, but also about something like an accent, or like it can be about the name you carry, or it can be about just your hair color. I remember actually, Vasilis, let me close with this little anecdote, because in other situations you called yourself a blackhead, Schwarzkopf.
Schwarzkopf.
Okay. I mean, we cannot see this now with this hairstyle of yours today on Zoom, but or on WebEx. Yeah, but it really can be about these kind of markers, if you are being racialized or not.
Yeah, thanks, Linda. I like the metaphor, and I think let's keep this spirit, and I hope to stay connected. And yeah, I thank you also for my colleagues who have initiated this webinar series, and I would like to thank Vasilis, Bambi, and Linda for your very insightful and engaging inputs. Much appreciated. I learned a lot, and a lot of inspiring moments. And thank you also for the participants, and Leo for patiently accompanying us along the way. And yeah, we keep you in the loop, and continue to check on the EMISCO website for further events, right, Pabati? Okay, cool.
Thank you
So
so much, Coco, for sharing
thank
this.
you. And
Thanks
then
all. Bye.
Bye.
see you